Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin, and it's been a huge week of World War III analysis. A lot of things going on in the orthosphere and elsewhere. Of course, the ceasefire, much like the other ceasefires in Lebanon, Gaza, and elsewhere, is not really much of a ceasefire. Iran opened fire on American ships that had attempted to breach the Iranian blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. They were fired upon. America then fired back and struck Iranian targets in Bandar Abbas and other places, Keshem Island, including other places. The UAE apparently was struck and then also retaliated and struck the Iranians again. So we're going to be discussing all of that, the state of the ceasefire, the naval blockade, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and what appears to be the slow collapse of even the negotiations. So we're going to be discussing the plan that everybody is waiting for, what Trump and the Iranians are supposedly discussing, and all of that, as well as the situation in Lebanon, the situation in Russia, Ukraine, some of the latest with Trump and other things domestically. Of course, the glorification of Father Seraphim Rose has been a hot topic ever since the Rocourt Synod in Munich made their recent announcement. So we're going to be discussing all of that and so much more. We had some great guests on the show this week, so everyone be sure to visit worldwarnow.co to check all of that out. Like this episode here at the very beginning, be sure to give us a like, whether you're listening on Substack, YouTube, or anywhere else. Give us a like, leave us a comment. Let us know what you think of this episode. But it has been a packed week, and once again, we're fearful and wary of getting news cucked because the ceasefire could fully collapse at any time. We were recording with Mike Painovich when the exchange of fire in the Gulf happened this past week, and we thought we were going to get, once again, completely news cucked. So we're watching very closely the OSINT channels and everywhere else. But before we dive in to all of that analysis, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing amazing, Conrad. Obviously, a huge escalation, as we discussed in our previous episode, 162 of World War Now. It's almost as if every week, peace really and ceasefire, all the terms that are agreed upon between these warring nations, always hangs in the balance. So it's very important for us to keep on track with these particular news stories as they break down. And obviously, the situation in Eastern Europe is ever escalating as well. So it's absolutely a huge news in terms of things going absolutely downhill in terms of stability in each respective region. So very tumultuous week indeed.
No, it is. And again, we're all sort of just waiting for the shoe to drop and the ceasefire to collapse, whether it be Israel to just start going in Lebanon again, or Israel to preemptively strike in Iran like they always do, forcing us to follow, as they know that we will, as the loyal golem that we are. The Iranians, of course, continue to strike the Erbil governorate in Iran, continuing to strike Iraqi Kurdish forces. That Trump, again, in the past few weeks has made comments about how the Kurds better use the weapons that we have given them. And again, it's clear that they're trying to basically recreate the conditions that they missed and didn't capitalize on in January when the Turks shared intelligence with the IRGC and Kurdish incursions from Iraq were squandered and stopped before the U.S. had, aircraft carriers in place and whatnot. And of course, the USS Gerald R. Ford has left the CENTCOM area of responsibilities, heading back to the United States after 300 plus days out at sea. And now the USS George H.W. Bush has joined the USS Abraham Lincoln amongst with the other large amount of U.S. troop carrier ships, amphibious landing vehicles, and of course the other destroyers and ships enforcing the U.S. naval blockade of Iran in the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, and just outside of the Persian Gulf itself. So despite the ceasefire happening, obviously there was that brief exchange of fire. The Iranians continue to strike the Kurds. And of course, the Lebanon ceasefire has obviously very much collapsed. But again, much like the first 4 days of the war were a total lie, where we heard 90% of Iran's missile launchers had been destroyed, air superiority, yada, yada, we're now hearing that 75+% of Iran's missile launchers are maintained. President Pezeshkian and Abbas Araghchi are openly posting about how Iran has replenished their missile drone launchers. All these sorts of things are operating at 120% now, and new satellite imagery is showing that huge amounts of IRGC Navy speedboats are still active in the Persian Gulf. In a single image, you can see 100 plus speedboats moving in formation throughout the strait. So they are able to disrupt and cause problems for these U.S. destroyers. They're obviously able to maintain the blockade and prevent all of these forces and energy from going out of the strait and supposedly just hugging the UAE and Oman coast so that America can protect them. That was supposedly the plan of Project Freedom. So obviously all of this is ongoing. The Iranians are maintaining control over the Strait of Hormuz. And the rumors this week were that Kuwait and Saudi Arabia had rejected American requests to use their bases for Project Freedom to protect shipping in the Strait of Hormuz to open things up. And then apparently a few days later, they decided, no, we're going to let them do it. So now we're still in this weird area where Project Freedom is or isn't ongoing. Iran apparently is, the ball is in their court. America and Trump are awaiting their response to a U.S. proposal, supposedly to reopen the strait and to get longer negotiations going on the nuclear file. But the Iranians have been very reticent to negotiate on the nuclear file at all at this point, and they claim that no real negotiations can occur while the U.S. blockade is going on, Dimitri. So if you have any details about the actual exchange of fire, the American response on Bandar Abbas, Keshem Island, please fill us in, as well as what we think the Iranians may say to this Trump-U.S. proposal to try to get negotiations back on track.
No, it's been a fairly intense week, and it, of course, commenced on the 4th of May, we can almost say. Sort of the dominoes began to fall, and it really started with actually a South Korean ship, the HMM Namu, a Panamanian-flagged cargo ship owned by South Korea that was just anchored off the coast of the United Arab Emirates and suddenly caught on fire because of an explosion. Of course, Trump and Pete Hegseth instantly on the 4th of May blamed Iran, that Iran attacked the South Korean commercial vessel, which actually wasn't attempting to transit the Straits of Hormuz at all to breach either the US nor the Iranian blockade, actually. And they actually requested the South Korean government review its participation in Operation Project Freedom, which they also announced on the same day. And Operation Project Freedom, this new US project, is, of course, the evolution, you can say, of Operation Epic Fury. So this is, and of course, you may say freedom for whom? It's not freedom for the Iranian people. It's actually, I think the concept behind it is it's freedom for commercial vessels to transit through the Straits of Hormuz. That's the plan behind the U.S. administration's naming of the project. And essentially, the concept is that the U.S. will safeguard commercial vessels to transit in and out from the Persian Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz into the Sea of Arabia and the Gulf of Oman, and actually the world trade for it to recommence in a full capacity. So what essentially happened on the 4th and 5th of May, you had 3 U.S. destroyers, so massive vessels accompanied by Apaches and some smaller vessels, actually enter in through the Straits of Hormuz on the 4th and 5th of May in order to, again, go into the Persian Gulf. Successfully, they did enter. And in fact, there was an Iranian threat to actually fire there was missiles fired in their respective direction, but it wasn't actually at them. So the Iranians fired off warning shots earlier this week, and there was no response from the US initially. And of course, when the 3 U.S. destroyers, of course, those are the USS Peralta, the Mason, and the Truxtun, and all of these are from different respective American navies. The Peralta, for example, is typically positioned in the Pacific Ocean around South Korea, Japan. So these 3 massive destroyers were in fact exiting out of the Straits of Hormuz when several days later, when Iran actually began to strike at them. So it's because the Iranian blockade was in fact breached, and there was no agreement as to, these destroyers actually entering into the straits and then leaving. Iran did take it upon themselves on the 7th and 8th of May to begin, again, striking at these destroyers. The response was, of course, quite harsh from the US. They, of course, destroyed some of the alleged, again, this is a statement out of CENTCOM. They said the alleged strikes against the USS destroyers by Iran was a combination of drones, missiles, as well as some small boats. So whether or not these boats were actually manned by Iranian sailors or if these were drone-style boats that we saw in the Black Sea, it's not quite clear. But the US, the 3 destroyers were allegedly unharmed, and they, of course, defended themselves. They also had, of course, the Apache helicopters flying in the air, shooting down any incoming missiles as well as drones. And so the US kind of came out of this unscathed. But what's interesting is there was a further exchange of fire in relation to the United Arab Emirates, actually, which Iran actually shot missiles at, specifically at one particular port, which is the port of Fujairah. This is located on the Omanian side of the United Arab Emirates. If you look at the UAE, it's basically situated on that Oman Peninsula, and Fujairah is actually located on the eastern side. So basically on the Sea of Arabian side, it's a port city, which is very key. Specifically, the Emiratis and the Americans were actually using Fujairah as a sort of refueling base in the Sea of Arabia. So the Iranians specifically struck in a very limited capacity. I mean, similar to some of the Ukrainian strikes against Russian coastal cities, they struck the city of Fujairah, the port city. And the response was quite intense. Of course, the US responded in relation to their destroyers getting shot at and the UAE getting shot at by attacking both an Iranian city and the Keshem Island. What's interesting is the city itself, Bandar Abbas, which we discussed quite a bit, that's the largest city located literally on the Straits of Hormuz. It's in the Straits itself. It is a key Iranian harbor, a key trading port. A population of roughly 500,000 to 600,000 people is absolutely giant, especially, we discuss cities a lot of the time on the show. So it's twice the size of Sumy, for example, in Ukraine, which the Russians may be besieging soon. So it's an absolutely massive town. And the US actually shot at this particular city, again, in a sort of limited capacity. Exactly what they were aiming at, it's unclear. And they also fired at Keshem Island, the largest island in the Straits of Hormuz, which is, we were hypothetically speaking about the possibility in the past, Conrad, that the US may in fact choose Keshem Island as a staging outpost for, developing this Operation Iranian Freedom, or whatever you want to call it, Operation Freeing the Straits of Hormuz in the near future. Keshem Island does have a very strategic position in relation to the Straits and how the US could actually utilize it in order to keep the Straits open, if of course they could reinforce some sort of defensive position for themselves in the first place. But it's really interesting that Keshem Island was struck, as well as Bandar Abbas. Sort of shows the US's eyes are really focused on the Straits area, and they're not quite interested anymore, perhaps in the Karg Island or some of the other distant islands located a fair distance away from the Straits, which, perhaps the US is trying to limit the attention of Iran specifically to the prospects of the transit through the Straits of Hormuz, or maybe the US was attempting to strike at some of the staging bases for these alleged Iranian small boats. Maybe they were actually launched off of Keshem Island. But so what we basically saw this week is, for the first time, you had US Navy vessels, 3 destroyers, as well as some accompanying vessels and Apache helicopters actually take a risk and go through the Straits of Hormuz. They weren't hit by any Iranian mines, not according to official CENTCOM or other reports. Even Iranians haven't claimed that. And they successfully entered and exited it after a few days, which does show that, with enough sustained defensive firepower, you can actually transit the Straits of Hormuz without asking the Iranians for permission. However, Conrad, 3 destroyers, that's a massive investment, not just, of course, a risk for the American sailors on board, but also a risk in terms of actual military hardware. And so you can't convoy all of the commercial vessels. And even mentioned that one South Korean vessel. South Korea has 26 more massive boats. They're much even bigger than the destroyers that will need to convoy them out of the Straits. So the US has no ability to just constantly be located in the Straits of Hormuz to convoy and to support, the commercial trade through the Straits into the Sea of Arabia. So it simply wouldn't be economically feasible or even possible in terms of refueling and other needs. So the Iranians absolutely still have the Straits of Hormuz well and truly locked down for commercial vessels. But it has shown, the Trump administration, Pete Hegseth, as Conrad, as being somewhat aggressive. They are willing to test the Iranians, and the Iranians, I think, in a sort of positive sign for themselves, they have attempted to strike at these US destroyers, unsuccessfully so, but they have sort of shown that they aren't willing to be, of course, meddled with, to be provoked by the US attempting to literally swim through their sovereign waters and attempting to, again, somehow bypass the ceasefire discussions with outright sort of denouncing the diplomacy attempts by Abbas Araghchi and other Iranian officials, simply by saying, look, we're just going to open the Straits of Hormuz by force through Operation Project Freedom, and we can ignore all of the Pakistani attempts at negotiating, all of the Omani negotiations, ceasefire discussions. We can just do this because we are powerful, we have a strong Navy. And I think this has somewhat failed. And even the 3 US destroyers, I think there's a lot of admirals in the US Navy and even probably officials in CENTCOM are sweating right now, because when Trump gives them the next order to transit the Straits again, it may not go as smoothly as the attempt this week.
No, that's very true. And I think at the end of the day, the situation in the Strait itself, whether it's Karg Island, which is currently experiencing a major oil spill, or it's, again, these strikes on Keshem Island, Bandar Abbas, the supposed plans to invade at Charbahar port, we don't really know the exact on-the-ground situation in the Strait. It's extremely difficult, even with, satellite imagery and people on the ground everywhere, and in the IRGC Navy reporting on things. It's really hard to know exactly what's going on. Was the Karg Island oil spill that's going on, is that sabotage from American unmanned nautical vessels being deployed from our ships? Who knows, right? Obviously, all sorts of things can be deployed from the coasts of our Gulf state allies and these other things. So it's really hard to actually know the exact details, because even as the fighting and shooting is happening when these ships try to pass through the Strait, it's hours later till we really get the details from the Iranians and then from CENTCOM. This is from Iranian military's Qatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, which is the main spokesperson right now for the IRGC. defensive operations. It says the aggressive terrorist and bandit American army violated the ceasefire by targeting an Iranian oil tanker ship moving from Iranian coastal waters in the Jask region towards the Strait of Hormuz, as well as another ship entering the Strait of Hormuz opposite the port of Fujairah in the UAE. And of course, the port of Fujairah, the oil processing facilities there have come under fire. The Iranians have actually denied the strikes on the UAE. I don't really know why. Maybe these are more U.S., false flags to make sure that we get dragged back into the war. But to me, it makes sense why the Iranians would be going tit for tat with the U.S. and the UAE as these attempts to breach their blockade of the Strait of Hormuz goes on. It goes on and says, at the same time, they carried out aerial attacks on civilian areas in cooperation with some regional countries on the coast of Bandar Kamir, Sirik, and Keshem Island, the statement added. Iran said that its forces responded to the U.S. attacks in the region by targeting U.S. warships, and U.S. Central Command released a statement that said 3 U.S. Navy destroyers came under attack. We've already discussed this. So that's the situation there. Trump has, made threats to turn Iran into one big glow. So people have been speculating that the nuclear situation or option is back on the table. Yeah, an Israeli official told Channel 12, they said, Israel sent a message to Washington saying that any resumption of fighting must include the destruction of Iran's energy infrastructure. Iran's energy infrastructure could be destroyed within just 24 hours, and destroying it would force Tehran into negotiations. Israel is trying to convey to Washington that targeting Iran's energy infrastructure is the only way to make progress. So, as usual, Jews desperately trying to ruin civilian life for the Goyim, for the average Persian in Iran, because again, I think obviously it's true that strategically, they're just trying to hurt the Iranians to bring them to the negotiating table. That makes sense. But that the Israelis, the Jews, the fact that Iranians are able to take to the street and celebrate their regime and wave flags peacefully, and the ceasefire had to happen, and they're basically able to take credit for winning the Purim War, like we've said. Again, Operation Epic Fury has officially ended. Marco Rubio and Donald Trump have officially said that, but the war is not over at all. They basically only announced the end of the operation, basically for congressional approval purposes, so that the 60-day clock can reset when the shooting starts once again, so they won't need congressional approval to continue to prosecute this war. So the Jews, though, in Israel, they look and they see the Iranian people, the fact that there's only been a few thousand casualties, that tens of millions of Iranians that support the regime, that hate Israel, that cheer when they see the missiles flying, that those people have food, they have electricity, they have clean water, and they have their homes that are safe. Well, the Jews want to see them plunged into darkness. They want to see them sweltering with heat, with no water, no power for air conditioning or anything else, and they want to see all that happen. So obviously, the defiance of the Iranian people, again, some people are saying that they're going to cave, and we're going to see what these next deals look like that Trump is going to try to force them into. But this is according to Anti-War. It says U.S. officials say Iran has 70% of pre-war missile stockpile and is assembling new ones. A U.S. official has told the Washington Post that he believes that Iran maintains about 70% of its pre-war stockpiles of missiles and 75% of its pre-war inventory of missile launchers, painting a starkly different picture of Iran's military capabilities following the U.S.-Israeli bombing campaign than what President Trump and his top officials have claimed. The official said there was also evidence that Iran has been able to recover and reopen almost all of its underground storage facilities, repair some damaged missiles, and assemble some new missiles that were nearly complete when the U.S. and Israel launched the war. Just a day earlier, President Trump claimed to reporters that Iran's missiles are mostly decimated. They have probably 19%, but not a lot by comparison to what they had. So it's pretty obvious that none of that is true. We have from Press TV, and this is the biggest indicator we really have, that Iran is pushing for a ceasefire. It says Iran wants a permanent ceasefire, denouncing the type of ceasefire in Lebanon and Gaza. Press TV's Maram Azarcher says that Iran seeks a lasting ceasefire with the U.S. So again, this includes likely U.S. withdrawals from the Middle East, reparations for the war damages, and other things that are never going to be agreed to by the United States. And, maybe the United States will agree to some of these things and lie about them to get Iran to agree to something, to get them to get rid of their nuclear dust, their enriched uranium, and then after that, just betray them again. So I think the Iranians, if they were smart, if they have any intention of giving that up, I think, unfortunately, this war might have been lost from the very beginning. But if they know that they need to keep that and they need to maintain their threshold status and enrichment, and of course, never even begin to negotiate on proxies, missiles, and still demand, again, repayments of debt, sanctions relief, and even U.S. withdrawal, then they're serious, and they must, if they're negotiating that way, then they are obviously fully prepared to resume the war, because they understand likely that Israel and these other powers, those are not demands that are going to be considered reasonable to them. But of course, the attempts, some of these Iranian crude tankers, apparently empty tankers, have been trying to bypass the U.S. naval blockade. So several of those have come under fire and been interdicted. The U.S. naval blockade, again, we don't know if there are any Iranian ships that have been able to go on the coast of Pakistan over to India and the Indian Ocean. There's been speculation that that is happening, but Iran is dramatically increasing its energy exports over land back to China. But of course, the speculation is that China is the main one pressuring Iran right now, to keep negotiations open and to not resume the war. Because I think if China hadn't been pressuring them, these recent aggressions and these recent, I guess, pushings of the boundaries of the ceasefire and pressing Iran's buttons from the United States, with China not restraining Iran, who knows if that wouldn't have just reignited into a full-on final battle here. But I'd love your thoughts on Iran's missile situation, Dimitri, as well as the Strait of Hormuz. Again, like we said, there are headlines all about how Trump paused Project Freedom due to backlash from Gulf Arab allies. NBC News reported on Wednesday that President Trump quickly ended the U.S. military operation to guide commercial ships through the Strait of Hormuz due to backlash from the U.S.'s Gulf Arab allies. But again, it seems that maybe they have acquiesced on that. I don't know what to trust when it comes to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, because one day it's they're itching Trump and they're pressing Trump to start the war again and to start striking really hard, and then the other hand they're like, no, we don't want anything to do with this. So very schizophrenic. I don't trust them at all. They're pretty much in the same camp as the Israelis at this point. But I think at the very least, when the energy infrastructure comes under fire again, when the war resumes, they will also be targeting Iran's overland rails more than they even did in the last one, to make sure that China is fully blocked off. A lot of people have been talking about how this is all a broader attempt to enforce an energy blockade on China. Of course, China is, it's going to take a long time for them to fully pivot to these Russian overland pipelines and these other things. And it's clear that the U.S. is building up these LNG capabilities, massive new LNG plant, import and export and production being built in Alaska right now to pick up the slack in East Asia. Because right now, huge trucks and tankers of U.S. LNG are now going into Thailand and Taiwan and these other places because, they're the ones orchestrating the blockade. They anticipated this. There were, of course, major billion-dollar economic deals to capitalize on all of this. So that's all going to be occurring. And whether China can facilitate these overland energy transfers soon enough, or if they're going to really be pressuring Iran to get the strait back open, we're going to see. But I'd love your thoughts on that, Dimitri, with the energy situation, with China, with the overland routes, before we move to some other conflicts in the region.
Yeah, I find it quite curious that there is a hyperfixation by the Israelis and Americans of, threatening not just Iranian military bases, which they claim most are destroyed at this point. So they claim Iran as the FANG. They claim they can't say any further that they will be attacking Pickaxe Mountain or any of these military sites, because according to their own official statements, most of those military sites have been either disabled or entirely devastated by their previous bombing campaigns. So, in order not to sort of juxtapose these two concurrent and I would say competing political positions, they need to again push the narrative further, which is now we'll be attacking Iranian energy sites. Similar to how, I suppose the analogy they could make is, President Putin is doing the same in Ukraine. In order to bring the Ukrainians to heel, he's attacking Ukrainian energy sites all across that particular country in Eastern Europe. And we can do the same in Iran. The only difference is, of course, the Iranian population is much larger than that of Ukraine. It's probably 4 times to 3 times the size at the bare minimum. And also Iran, for all intents and purposes, has been sanctioned for a lot longer time than Ukraine. It has been a lot less of the beneficiary from, for example, all the industry buildup in Ukraine. And Ukraine was the industrial heartland of the USSR, so it has much more, I would say, secure, much more already pre-established energy lines, and it has been, well and truly, I would say, a more civilized landscape in terms of actual investment from all kinds of European countries, primarily, of course, the Russian Empire and the USSR proper back in the day. So striking energy targets within Iran would cause a much more devastating effect. And I think really curious is the implications will Israel and America be striking at Iranian energy sites located on the coast, for example, the Bushehr Russian nuclear power plant, or the construction of the 2 other nuclear power plants located on the Persian Gulf. Big query there. Will they be killing Russian citizens, killing Rosatom, Russian nuclear physicists and scientists located in that power plant who are still operating it today? This is the big question marks on how will Russia respond to this sort of act of aggression, because it is a Russian nuclear energy location, right? It is providing energy to the nearby Bushehr Peninsula and some of the other locales, and no doubt there are power lines dragging from the Bushehr nuclear power plant because, it is a civilian energy resource, which again, this is exactly what the US and Israel are threatening. There's also questions about will they be somehow attacking some of those energy lines, dragging on through Azerbaijan, for example, the LNG exports that Russia sends through Azerbaijan to countries like Turkey and Europe, of course, where they get the goods are relabeled. So Russian LNG is sort of restamped with a Azeri trademark stamps and then resold to European countries. Will the US be somehow impacting all of that energy trade located in the northwest of Iran and kind of stopping energy outflow into Iran on that particular end? Will they somehow be attacking the North Iranian Caspian Sea ports, which will no doubt, of course, if Iran will be suffering a huge energy crisis sometime, towards the summer of this year. And you can just imagine the heat in the Middle East will really pick up, especially with, the so-called escalation taking place in the Middle East at the moment. How the Russians will no doubt be sending their energy resources as much as possible through the Caspian. So will the US be threatening those ports and those Russian ships? And the other query is, of course, in the northeast of the country, Turkmenistan, for example, providing gas, oil, other resources to Iranian provinces potentially located in the northeast section of the country. Probably the part of Iran which is the least affected by the current ongoing warfare and what has happened earlier this year during the insane bombing campaign by America and Israel over Iranian territory. It's almost as if that northeastern section is perhaps the safest, and that's most likely where most of those airports are located, including some of the covert sites where Iran has been hiding their Sukhoi planes that they received from Russia, as well as maybe some of those military exports that they continue to receive from China through Central Asia via those massive aerial transportation planes. So it's really an interesting theory that we can sort of put into play here. But no doubt there will be, of course, huge drought implications. Humanitarian crisis will be expanded upon if the US begins again attacking Iranian energy sites sometime in the near future. I mean, any time before, say, September, October, throughout the summer, I think it will have a devastating effect on Iran. But no doubt Iran still has most of its ballistic missile storage and launching facilities active. I can't speak too much about the surface-to-air missile launching sites, which we will no doubt the US and Israel have struck in the first instance, as well as some of those long to mid-range anti-air radars, which Iran did have prior to the war commencing. No doubt most of those are destroyed at this point because of the effectiveness of the US strikes, as well as the footage we've received from the coastline of the Straits of Hormuz and some of those other areas in the Persian Gulf. You do see American planes flying fairly closely, the warplanes fairly closely to the ground, which does show that they do feel a certain fearlessness, and that most likely the Iranian mid to long range radars are just not active. And so they're not able to actually shoot down those American warplanes as effectively as they could have in the past. So it's really interesting how the US is just trying to sort of cement its superiority over that region and turn the entirety of Iran into this massive no-fly zone, as they did in Libya, for example, which didn't have the same ability to shoot down American warplanes during that civil war in 2011 and 2012, which ended in 2012. But it's really curious that Iran is also multitasking, Conrad, and continuing to bomb, for example, staging military sites located in places like Erbil in Iraq, where you have Kurds constantly training for something and for their own special military operation. And the Iranians are sending these militarized drones and long-range missiles every now and then into the so-called autonomous regions of Kurdistan, located in the northwestern Iraq, you can say, on the border of Iran, where there are these bases of Kurds, which again receive intelligence, receive military assistance from America and Israel. Iran completely understands this. I mean, the IRGC no doubt has entire folders and dossiers on all of the Kurdish leaders. They know exactly who the Kurds receive assistance from, and all these so-called cozy imagery received about the Kurds, that these are just an independent people who want a homeland just like the Tuaregs. I mean, this is all like false propaganda. At this point, the Kurds have turned into another Middle Eastern golem. Yes, probably not a head-chopping Islamic one per se, but no doubt just a similar sort of battering ram, another, baseball bat that the Americans and the Israelis could use against their opponents. In this case, the Iranians, I think, correctly suspect that the Kurds in all of these Zewi Aspi base, for example, that was hit by free drones, and all these other little staging camps. These are not refugee bases with tents and innocent women and children. I mean, if there are women and children in these bases, it's because they are the war brides, so to speak, of the Kurdish warlords who are stationed in them. And Iran, by constantly harassing and hitting these bases, they're sort of keeping the Kurds on edge, sort of telling them, look, we know what you guys are preparing for. We know that you will be used against us if there is instability within Iran, if our border sentries do fall down, or if they're attacked by Israel and the Americans. You will be entering into Iranian territory. So they're kind of signaling to the Kurds, do not try us. We dare you. So they are keeping them essentially in this constant state of stress, which I think is the correct way to go about it. If you recall, during the Syrian civil war, the Syrian government, the Russians, were doing exactly the same thing to the terrorists stationed in the Idlib province, which is close to Antakya, adjacent to Turkey, where the HDS and the ISIS, former ISIS fighters and all kinds of Al-Qaeda groups were receiving essentially training by the Turkish military. There was entire months and months of long-term bombing campaigns, sort of on and off. Every single week, the Russians would fly sorties into these areas and drop bombs at specific training camps. So back then, they didn't launch as many drones as they do today, but the concept was similar. It's like always keeping these particular militarized militant groups, which will be used against your allied country, in this case, Syria, keeping them in check, and which is exactly what the Iranians are doing against the Kurds. The Iranians are not the aggressors here. This is, you can almost say, a defensive tactic, which again, even the ancient Romans used it against the Germanic and Celtic barbarians. Whenever the Romans would cross the Rhine into the ancient lands of Germany in order to cull some of the tribes located on the Rhine border to the east of it, they did so because they would prevent further future massive incursions and big, almost genocidal raids into Roman territories. I mean, this was the concept, and that's exactly what Iran is doing here against the Kurds. So whenever you hear the Kurds crying wolf, they're crying basically that they're being harassed and hit by the Iranians. Just know that Iran's not just simply doing this because they're big meanies or because they're rabid Shia Islamists. They have a particular purpose behind it. And in fact, some might say Russia should have probably done the same after 2014, but in fact, waiting 8 years really has caused the situation to overflow into a much larger special military operation. So kind of watching this region, I think, very closely, considering Iran is not a trivial military power. It's much stronger than Syria. Even you can say much stronger than Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And it will take a lot more. It will take a multi-pronged approach from Israel, US, in order to weaken it to a point where they could simply overthrow the regime that's currently in power. And that has, at this point, immense public support. Notice, Conrad, even these last 2 to 3 weeks of relative ceasefire peace within Iran have not brought around any massive protests within the Iranian state itself. None of the major cities have experienced any public unrest, and that's because I believe the majority of the Iranian public now understand that their primary enemy is actually outside of Iran. It's not inside of it. It's not the IRGC. It's not the mullahs. Like, these people, as much as they may dislike them or dislike their political views, the people who actually want death and want to dismember and disassemble and maim Iran to the point where it will never come back and never recover are actually the nations that are attacking at the moment, unfortunately, America and Israel.
100%. And we have to remember, we talk about this on our recent Ether Hour with Mike Painovich, double Ether Hour week, right? We have an Ether Hour with Benjamin Michael, formerly known as Luigi, as well as Mike Painovich, host of TDS, Mike Check, sort of leader of the TRS network. So check out that really incredible few shows we did. But of course, the Israelis, they're afraid of coming under fire again. Their pause in Lebanon, everyone says, oh, Trump is restraining Israel. Everyone's pointing to this as evidence that Israel is a colonial outpost of the U.S. But trust me, Israel and Netanyahu only stopped because they viewed it as necessary. If they had an edge in Lebanon, like Mike talks about in that episode we did with him, they would not have stopped. They would keep pushing. And the FPV drones in general are really giving the Jews a run for their money in Lebanon. And it shows you how worried Israeli society is about not just Lebanon and Hezbollah, but Iran, about the Houthis in Yemen and the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq. This is on Twitter from the New York Times. It says, Trump has removed nearly all of its interceptors from the world to the Middle East. It has had to divert munitions from U.S. commands in Asia and Europe to the Middle East. There will be no stockpiles left for China. The State Department did not provide a breakdown of how many interceptor missiles each country would receive. A congressional official said the dollar values were $9.3 billion from Kuwait, $6.25 billion from the Emirates, and $1.625 billion from Bahrain. The letter to Congress from the State Department lists 2 types of Patriot interceptor missiles and the orders from each country, according to a copy obtained by the Times. This is after a U.S. deal of $17 billion worth of missiles to the Gulf states to try to replenish them. The 3 orders amount to about 4,250 missiles, based on the fact that a single interceptor missile costs about $4 million. That is in addition to the another large order last Friday. In one of its new news releases on the $8.6 billion in new emergency sales, the State Department said Qatar was ordering $4 billion of interceptor missiles, which equates to about 1,000 units. It would also take years to produce those amounts. The Patriot air defense system is made by Raytheon, and that company and Lockheed Martin produced missiles for it. Since President Trump and Israel started a new war against Iran on February 28th, U.S. military has used more than 1,300 Patriot interceptor missiles, according to internal Defense Department estimates, putting a significant dent into the global American stockpiles. So again, China, North Korea, all these places that have major U.S. Air defense deployments are being totally depleted for the defense of Israel. But of course, this week in Lebanon, the ceasefire continues to collapse. We saw just today 50 plus Israeli strikes, which is higher than certain days during the war before the ceasefire. Hezbollah responded and had 26 plus targets. But the big strike in the past few days was a major assassination strike in Dahye in the Beirut suburbs. This is from Lebanon News and OSINT here. It says, Dahye begins clearing debris after the Israeli strike. As Netanyahu warns, there is no immunity for anyone in Beirut, despite the fact, of course, that Netanyahu and Trump agreed that there would be no Israeli strikes on Beirut in the midst of the ceasefire, because Trump already said, look, we know you got to keep striking Hezbollah in the south, even though we're calling it a ceasefire, because you're Jews and you can't, keep your word. We understand it. But he said no striking on Beirut. And they did one of the largest Beirut strikes they've done recently, not as big as the one that killed, 300 plus people, but entire buildings and blocks have been decimated. It says Hezbollah has not yet issued an official confirmation or denial on the assassination of Ahmed Galev Balut, also known as Malik Balut, who was identified by Israel as a senior Rod 1 forces commander, and that's who they were attempting to target in those strikes. So again, Hezbollah has responded. They destroyed a Patriot missile battery. They destroyed several more Merkava tanks as the tank disabled number continues to rise due to Hezbollah's usage of drones. But again, in the midst of all of this, in the midst of Israel striking the capital, killing civilians, hundreds of civilians killed since the quote-unquote ceasefire was put into place, yet we still get this from Axios. Israel and Lebanon will hold a new round of talks in the United States in 1 week from May 14th to May 15th, according to officials from the State Department. So Joseph Ayoun still desperately wants to talk to Netanyahu and these other Jews, despite the fact that they're invading his country. I'm sure Trump is going to try to get him again to deploy the Lebanese armed forces to fight against Hezbollah, but the Lebanese armed forces are not going to go along with that. They fundamentally understand who is defending their country. So again, Lebanon, at some point, it seems like they're just going to have to get pushed hard enough to where even enough Christians and even some Sunnis finally ally with the resistance, and they form a new entire system in Lebanon, frankly, based around resistance to Israel, not around religious power sharing and legacy of the French colonial people there and all this other nonsense, trying to keep these westernized Maronites in power. So very interesting developments in Lebanon. Of course, Hezbollah, they continue to valiantly fight there. But it seems to me like, again, with 50 plus strikes a day, the ceasefire in Lebanon can be officially called entirely dead, even more so than the largely collapsing Iranian ceasefire.
No, certainly, of course, the bloody attacks against the Lebanese people have continued literally every single day. There are reports similar to this one from the 8th of May, where it says Israeli airstrikes kill 5 in southern Lebanon and injure 1. So these sort of reports are coming out literally every single day. Israel, of course, has to account for bombing such large spaces located with civilians. So, of course, their recent report from this week is that it has killed more than 85 Hezbollah militants and struck 180 sites in southern Lebanon in the past week. Of course, Israel, when it makes these sort of official statements, the IDF doesn't provide any evidence whatsoever. So it's even more abstract than some of those Russian military reports from early on in the special military operation, where sometimes the Russians even provided map footage or even photographic evidence of some of the sites which they've struck. However, in this particular conflict, Israel provides none of these things. So it's really with a huge grain of salt that we, of course, are taking all of these Israeli reports about success of attempting to, again, destroy these Hezbollah defensive locations south of the Litani River. And we, of course, understand that clearly the objectives of Israel are multifaceted. Not only do they want to destabilize Lebanon internally, they want to cause enough pressure to the Lebanese government in order for them to, as Conrad said correctly, take up arms and sort of rein in Hezbollah themselves, which, again, the military nor any of the law enforcement agencies within Lebanon, they will not be doing that anytime soon, due to a multiplicity of reasons. But specifically, I think Israel is just trying to, again, create this artificial depopulation buffer zone, this no man's land between its own territory and the mainland of Lebanon located north of the Litani River, which, of course, again, all of Lebanese land is this land of Greater Syria at one point, which was united in sort of the pre-Sykes-Picot landscape. So all of this land necessarily was at one point united into one, and none of it was necessarily artificially depopulated by anyone. People could trade and travel freely between all of these particular lands. Now they've been turned into wastelands. There's minefields being laid, of course, by the Israelis, similar to those in the Golan Heights, the Golan Heights, the West Bank is another good example of where Israel has created huge minefields, which probably can never be crossed for like decades on end unless there's intense minesweeping operations being done. So they're basically turning themselves into almost, whilst expanding outwards, Israel is also turning a lot of its border territories into entirely inhospitable landscapes, which again cannot simply be traversed by anyone, whether it's locals or potentially in the future pilgrims who want to travel these sort of particular lands. So it's all very tactfully done by the Israeli leadership, and that's really unfortunate. And there's obviously a lot of concerns from the Christians living in Lebanon and Israel and Palestine specifically about the potential outstretching to the international community. Of course, the Pope has spoken out in favor of the Lebanese ceasefire. There's been a lot of UNIFIL, that is UN-affiliated Italian groups being located south of the Litani River who've actually been actively trying to save people from the rubble. But notice, Conrad, a lot of these United Nations soldiers, and most of them are Roman Catholic in religion, actually not able to retaliate at all when the Israelis literally strike positions next to them. They simply have to watch and sort of recover things from the rubble. The other really interesting, and I think this is quite devious, move being used by the Israelis, and President Joseph Aoun has actually asked the Israelis not to do this, and he said that he'll be visiting, or he'll be sending a delegation to the European Union, I think very soon in the next few weeks, where Joseph Aoun will be requesting for the EU to pressure Israel not to detonate and bulldoze homes south of the Litani River at their own discretion. So Israel, it comes into a particular city or village, it notices a few homes, maybe the homes have been struck, partially damaged by by the Israelis' own bombing campaigns, and then they bring in bulldozers and they wipe the entire home out. Instead of renovating and fixing it, they just destroy all of these urban settlements. And these are people who own perhaps several tens of thousands of American dollars. These are not very rich villagers and settlers. I mean, not settlers, but local Lebanese natives who live in these particular places. And everything, all of their, any goods they have in these real estates, their own homes, their investments of their lives, the homes of their grandparents are completely wiped out. Like their own history is destroyed under the pretext of the Israelis saying, well, these homes aren't safe to live in, so we are giving the Lebanese people a hand. I mean, how devilish can you actually be? Not only do you, of course, drive these people north of the Litani by turning them into refugees, but also they have no home to return to. I mean, this is, talk about a Nakba 2.0 taking place at the moment south of the Litani River. It's absolutely horrendous. And it is incredibly sad that both Orthodox Christians and Roman Catholics are in the crosshairs of the Israelis south of the Litani River. And as we've heard from many people, great guests from Lebanon on the show, there's really no differentiation. The Israelis do not care whether or not they strike against Christians or Muslims. There isn't this preferential striking against Hezbollah targets only. I think to them, it's a massive benefit if they can cause some sort of uproar and upstirring within the Lebanese population of Christians against Muslims or Muslims against Christians. And so, in fact, they try to bomb everybody, at least in some capacity, evenly, so that there's anxiety and the angst of Lebanese society is driven to a certain culmination and climax point to where, hopefully, I mean, in their eyes, Lebanon can again reignite into another stage of civil war. And similar to Syria, the country can eventually crumble or become this massive, eternal client state of the Zionist project, which again is, hopefully it doesn't really come to that. I think eventually, Conrad, what might actually happen is the Lebanese government may in fact be somehow supplanted by a more radical anti-Israeli entity. And no doubt there'll be some changes to the constitution, because you cannot be literally struck, your sovereignty cannot be breached this many times. If you are not a sovereign state, if you are public servants and you aren't able to protect your own country from foreign intervention, from such harassment, then you probably shouldn't be in power at all. And that's, I think, the challenge Joseph Aoun and a lot of his parliamentarians are facing at the moment.
Yeah, again, I think in the West, people continue to overestimate or underestimate just the tolerance that a lot of Lebanese people have for their people and their country being invaded and bombed by invaders that haven't been there since, for less than 100 years. So it's really incredible to witness. And at some point, I think the Lebanese forces government is really going to have to start answering to the people in the South and the people that are watching their villages and homes getting blown up. But Unless you have any other comments on the Middle East situation, Dimitri, of course, the situation in Iraq and the Kurds, we're going to continue to watch that. The situation in Syria, we continue to see Israel slowly but surely advance into the Quneitra province. They're still continuing to protect the Druze there. And of course, al-Jilani has talked about, getting these new radar systems and getting help from Turkey and Qatar. But fundamentally, it's obvious that Syria is far, far away from becoming a threat to Israel anytime soon. But the situation in Russia and Ukraine, despite the fact that it is not the focus, negotiations in Russia and Ukraine between the U.S. seem to have entirely fallen through. No one's talking about that anymore in the midst of all of the Iran stuff going on. And of course, the major strikes on the Russian energy sector have dramatically increased, and it's getting to the point where Russia is having major disruptions in its energy production. And this is also part of the strategy against China, because if Russian energy is getting destroyed and Chinese energy can't come out of Iran, then you can see that this long game that the US and the West are playing against China needs to, instead of trying to get Iran to come to the negotiating table, China needs to be empowering Iran to actually take down this golem and allow them to actually, instead of just opening the Strait of Hormuz to everybody, how about you empower them to take down the U.S. Navy blockade and then just freely ship oil to you while restricting it to your enemies, even in the region. So, of course, that's the reality there. But it's clear that the U.S. wants to prevent Russia from benefiting too much from the worldwide, oil shortage and the increasing prices of fuel. And Russia, obviously, one of the main beneficiaries of that economically, the U.S. being one of the other ones. But these major strikes on the Tuops and the other facilities in the Baltic Sea and in the Caspian and on the Sea of Azov, these are really starting to actually impact the general global flow of Russian oil to its allies and its other customers around the world. But before we discuss that, Dimitri, feel free to discuss the situation on the front line in Donbass, in Zaporozhye, where despite the major attacks on infrastructure, Russian forces continue to advance on the front line.
They are indeed, and there have been more villages liberated by the Russians. For example, in the Seversk direction, the Russians liberated Krivaya Luka, and this is, of course, in the Donetsk People's Republic. So there's small villages being liberated here and there. In the Kharkovskaya Oblast, obviously, there's still fighting happening, specifically in Kupiansk, of course, the long-suffering city now being turned almost into a new Konstantinovka or a new Bakhmut. The footage, by the way, from Konstantinovka is absolutely insane. The Konstantinovka city that could have held over 110,000 people, one of the largest cities that has experienced, of course, the special military operation, is being turned into an absolute wasteland, especially some of the suburbs and city blocks with apartment buildings on the sort of outskirts. They look absolutely post-apocalyptic. I mean, I think basically a tactical nuclear weapon wouldn't have caused as much damage as obviously that of the combined Russian and Ukrainian artillery strikes and drone strikes, specifically on some of these city blocks. So they've been completely leveled out, almost like you can basically just abandon the entire city forever and simply rebuild Konstantinovka in a new location. Fortunately, it's not a very ancient city with obviously the churches there have been completely destroyed and demolished as well. But we can sort of consider that this particular landscape is simply an example of what happens when urban warfare is conducted in a city that has been turned into a military fortress by the Ukrainians. And the Russians are not willing to back down. They're simply going to strike through these defenses and take the Ukrainians on by force, which is, again, an interesting tactic. It is almost a Third Reich, Stalingrad sort of approach to things. And, that's been criticized quite a bit. The Russians have reached the outskirts of two particular other cities in Kharkovskaya Oblast, the Shesterovka and Losivka villages. And they reached these two villages just as the ceasefire commenced. And this is, of course, the great 2-day ceasefire, or the weekend ceasefire of the Victory Day, which has already taken place. And again, it's been more or less the Ukrainians have already begun breaching it. But the Russians have somewhat halted their advances on almost all locations of the special military operation, because the ceasefire was in fact announced somewhat unilaterally by President Putin himself. And there was a threat put out by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Specifically, there was verbal confirmation of that by Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson of Sergei Lavrov, who said basically the Russians will be retaliating strongly against Ukrainian decision-making centers and the center of Kiev. So specifically, most likely referring to Bankovskaya Ulitsa, Bankovskaya Street, where most of the Ukrainian executive buildings, including the president's house, Zelensky's house, the Verkhovna Rada, are located in the city of Kiev itself, in the central business district, right? And what's interesting is, obviously, they said, look, if the Ukrainians dare to breach this ceasefire, like they have during the Easter ceasefire or previous ceasefires that have been attempted for special feast days and other holidays, we will retaliate very strongly. And some people have been critical. They've been saying, well, why doesn't Russia just strike against the decision-making centers anyway? I mean, the war's been ongoing for 4 years, or the special military operation, whatever you want to call it. Clearly, the decisions and the calls in order for the Ukrainians to advance across multiple sites, the executive hardcore decisions against Russians and populations of the special military operation zones, they've been actually coming from these specific decision-making centers. Where are all the NATO advisors actually located and living? It's in the hotels located nearby these decision-making centers in the center of Kiev. Why haven't you, for example, why hasn't the Russian army or the long-range missile forces, why haven't they struck these locations before? It's almost as if there is a unspoken agreement between the two nations of not to, take out people in high positions of leadership from the very beginning. I mean, this is just another conspiracy of mine, but it is very telling. A lot of Russian geopolitical analysts have been incredibly critical of Russia not striking these decision-making centers, and something that is insanely confusing. Even, I think, Joseph Jugashvili Stalin during the Second World War, if he had a chance to strike at the center of Berlin throughout the entire conflict, he probably would have done so, but he simply didn't have the long-range missile capacity, nor the drones, nor the warplanes to do so during the Second World War. So it is very curious, but I think some of the more provocative actions by the state of Ukraine was, of course, the attacking of oil refineries, oil gas pumping stations in the city of Yaroslavl, which is located, if you look at the map, it's literally the Russian heartland of between Vologda and Nizhny Novgorod. Yaroslavl is a very ancient city. This is somewhere near Vladimir Suzdalski, so it's in the northeastern parts of Russia. So places which you read about in the old Russian lives of saints, where, you have the Yaroslavl, for example, like just for reference, this is the place where Patriarch Tikhon of Moscow, and a former North American hierarch, where he was, of course, stationed during his long tenureship as an archbishop and metropolitan. This is his particular oblast and province, and Ukrainians are striking it. It's way beyond Moscow. So the drones and the Neptune missiles are flying up to a very long distance. They are being shot down by the Russians, but just keep in mind, these long-range Neptunes and UAVs, the Ukrainian, they're almost like UFOs at this point, flying across Russian territory, they're flying through these specific gray area gaps, dodging Russian air defense. Or at least, they fly several sorties, the Russians shoot them down, and they notice, are there any gaps that sort of show up on the maps for us? They analyze the gaps, and they, of course, fly as if through a maze through these random Russian oblasts and provinces in order to strike their targets. And yes, very interestingly, as Conrad correctly put, these are energy facilities that are being struck. For example, the Yanos refinery in Yaroslavl, or the Permanefta or Org-Intes oil refinery, belonging to Lukoil, one of the Russian largest oil and crude oil refinery stations. I mean, these are very suspicious targets by the Ukrainians. I do note the last week's Perm attack was more, I think, on the nose, because most of Russia's industrial military factories are actually located around that Perm, Yekaterinburg region in the South Urals. So that was probably a bit more sensitive for the Russians. And I would say the Russians most likely prefer the Ukrainian strike at their oil refineries and logistical hubs rather than a lot of these military industrial sites. But generally, I think some of the craziest news we've had from this week was the insane attack by the Ukrainians on Moscow. So there's been at least 50 Ukrainian drones shot down, actually headed for Moscow city itself, which is absolutely insane, considering the military march, the Victory Day parade, will be taking place literally several hours from now. So that's over the last 24 hours. 50 drones began approaching Moscow. They were shot down. Several drones actually crashed into apartment buildings within Moscow suburbs, some of which Conrad was staying in some of those suburbs nearby on the, I believe, the southwestern parts of Moscow and western parts of Moscow just recently. So in fact, a lot of those drones crash landing or being shot down in Moskovskaya Oblast, generally speaking. I mean, if you look at a map, they could potentially even hit that military cathedral that Shoigu and Timur Ivanov constructed, a massive, of course, military cathedral, some Soviet symbolism, but dedicated to the victory over the Third Reich in the Second World War. I mean, these are key sort of sites of, I would say, Russian military prowess. And the Western people would say it's a propaganda site, but generally the Ukrainians potentially could be targeting these places as well if they have the chutzpah to do so. And it is just very, very concerning. Obviously, the parade will be taking place several hours after the recording of this episode, so it will be very interesting to see if the Russians, how much hardware will they display? Will there be an aerial parade? Or will the parade be put off entirely in the last minute? It's not quite sure. There are, of course, Russian troops already stationed in Moscow. A lot of them are reservists. None of these troops have actually been taken from the front lines. And in some way, I think, Conrad, it is correctly correct to say, like, there probably shouldn't be victory day parades during an ongoing conflict at all. Even Joseph Stalin, Jugashvili himself, during the Second World War, the only two parades he really held during the war was the first one after the Russians sort of pushed the Germans and the Third Reich back from after the defense of Moscow in 1941, and they had basically a reservist mobilized parade where you had mobilized troops literally parade through the Red Square and then head off to the front line. So it was almost like a transitionary parade, and it was a big sign of obviously defending Russia against the invaders during Operation Barbarossa. So it was almost like the parade was quite tactful, and obviously the occasion which they celebrated was not a very nice one to Orthodox Christians. It was they were celebrating not victory, they were celebrating in November. It was a celebration of the October Revolution of Lenin, Trotsky and friends. So a Bolshevik parade basically during the Second World War. And you can kind of see how God most likely did not look fondly upon that, which is probably why there was so much more unsuccessful antics during the Second World War, because they would literally push Bolshevik propaganda during a civilizational conflict, which is quite unfortunate. But the only other parade Stalin held during the Second World War was a parade of German prisoners, and that was later towards the end when Berlin was already being or close to being besieged. So it really, the fact that Stalin didn't do so for propaganda purposes, and that was somebody who was very, very much obsessed with world state power, is all we can say is that, well, if the victory parade this year is, for example, held in a very I would say smaller format, it probably wouldn't even be a bad thing. I think it's the practical realities are Russia is at war. If people need to stop calling it a special military operation, that's absolutely ludicrous. Patriarch Kirill has already called it a civilizational, spiritual war, a conflict of immense scale that will define the future of the Russian people. I mean, there's very, very powerful and not hyperbolic statements, I would say, from the Patriarch. And it's time for the Russians, even if they are experiencing incremental progressions on the front lines, to actually begin taking this war seriously. And I mean, specifically, which Russians? Obviously, the ones on the front lines are, in fact, well and truly investment. It's the elites at the very top of society who are trying to portray this as some sort of isolated operation, similar to the Israeli operation in Gaza. Or I'm not sure what analogy they try to make in their own minds, but this is not an anti-terrorist operation. It's literally a war between two nation states. And that's how it needs to be treated. So, and of course, the Russians, as they approach some of these key sites, if a war is declared, which I doubt very much, but I think President Putin, we're long past the point, Conrad, of this being actually transitioning into a proper military conflict. I think the appearances of this being a sort of a legal dispute of some sort, a anti-terrorist operation, I think these appearances will be upheld by Putin's presidential regime. For in the past, we've suspected that on the 9th of May, Putin would be declaring a massive mobilization or something of that sort, but that's not what we're going to see here. I would just like to address a very curious theory, actually. Recently in Russia, they've had a lot of major celebrities and media figures who represent different swaths of society coming out and speaking out against Putin. Specifically, I'm referring to Bonya, the Russian Instagram model who has, of course, millions of followers. In fact, she came out with that video address on Instagram, and she's, of course, a major Russian media star, TV star, singer, whoever she is. I'm not too familiar with her work, but she basically released the video address in critiquing President Putin for not paying enough attention to the needs of the Russian people. And her video address received more views and likes than most of President Putin's speeches. I think actually any of his speeches in recent years, besides the one in which the special military operation was declared in 2022. So somebody like Bonya would receive more views. And you also had, obviously, Eremeslo, the sort of sycophantic United Russia liberal, you can almost say, coming out against Putin and saying that Putin is sabotaging Russia. Even a figure who me and Conrad would look at quite fondly, Pavel Gubarov, going on a 3+ hour interview on YouTube, receiving millions of views, again, criticizing Putin for being not decisive enough. All of these figures coming out inside of Russia at the same time criticizing the Russian executive power. I'm not sure if this is a coincidence or if potentially they're all pushing some sort of united front agenda. Maybe certain groups within, some groups within the Russian bureaucracy are actually trying to maybe make Putin appear to be somewhat indecisive, somewhat weak. And you did see almost an entire tranche of these figures coming out, speaking out against executive Russian power. And there has also been, of course, the crazy conspiracy rumor, which I think is entirely false and fake, of Sergei Kozhegyotovich Shoigu, the former defense minister of the Russian Federation, potentially trying to conspire against Putin and maybe carrying out a coup or a revolution on the 9th of May, And it's like, hello, I mean, even if that is true, Shoigu has less popularity, I think, in the army than probably any other general. If you recall, during the Prigozhin revolt in Rostov-on-Don, when Prigozhin mentioned to General Alexeyev of the GRU, says, "We want Shoigu." And what was General Alexeyev's response? "You can have him. Go and get him." So I don't think Shoigu is popular at all. I think these are a very bizarre conspiracy that Shoigu is trying to overturn Putin. Shoigu is made from the same cloth as Vladimir Putin, the same sort of Yeltsinoid elite. They come from, Shoigu in some cases much older than Putin in that regard. But just, yeah, people need to have a reality check. And Shoigu has been a great service person in Putin's service for a while. I doubt there will be an internal conspiracy. I think more things would need to frustrate the Russian population for them to do so. But again, these theories are circulating all over the Russian internet right now. Things aren't very stable, and people are extremely triggered at the random internet blackouts that are taking place. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens on the 9th of May, if Russia will in fact respond after red lines are crossed. And God forbid, Conrad, we see some sort of drone or Neptune, or God forbid whatever they call it, Pink Panther flamingo attack against most of the Red Square during the parade itself. I think most likely that will be a red line which neither Putin nor Belarusov will, again, could sweep under the rug, and they will have to respond to the fullest extent and maybe even strike something like Bankovskaya Street in Kiev and actually maybe take out certain key decision makers, if not Zelensky personally. It'll be a huge escalation on the 9th of May.
Now, I saw the Kremlin was responding to, Zelensky. He posted, he's like, "I give the Russians permission to have their May parade." And the Kremlin was like, "We do not need permission." Obviously, the Ukrainians, they posted the coordinates and said we could strike them at any time. Obviously, they wouldn't really succeed in striking the parade, but it's clear that there is no goodwill. Putin and these people, they seem to think that surely if we do the May parade and appeal to them on that, they won't destroy such a sacred, look, they don't cease fire for Easter. They don't cease fire for Christmas most of the time. But you think that, the communist spirit will unite us more than Christianity, more than anything else. So very silly that they still, you're going to war with these people literally, and you still are trying to appeal to some Slavic communist identity, I guess, that you all have in common. It's very silly. But speaking of internet blackouts, or should I say internet call-outs, our favorite Russian commentator, Alexander Dugin, who again, I consider an acquaintance, a friend of the show in some capacity, but he basically fully called for the destruction of the white race in some capacity. And obviously he clarified, as he usually does, what he really meant. But, he said, I think he's deleted some of the tweets. So one of the ones he said, "I'm more white than almost all of you. I'm Indo-European Aryan and proud to be it. You are wrong Aryans, liberal, weak pervert. You are modern. This kind of whiteness is shame. Real whites are Iranians, Indians, Evolians. The rest is a thrash." Man, the Indian comment thrown in there. But it also just says, he said, "You are not the people. You are stupid slaves of the Epstein's menu of cruel cannibal elites. You are eating your brains are. It is why you watch Euphoria, because all of you are perverts, disgusting civilization. No reason to exist. Please die. Whites have installed the liberalism and the capitalism worldwide, and among themselves, that was suicidal invention, the worst perversion of tradition. Whites, they are destroying the world. They are destroyed the world in themselves. To be white means to be nihilist. It is a self-hatred of race. It causes so many troubles to others and to itself. It lost the right to be something. No arguments to support their existence." And again, obviously he goes on and says that all this liberalism and all this stuff comes from whites. But man, my only response to Dugin is, simply, one, all the stuff he's blaming on white people is what Jews do. And two, just take the words from half of these posts and replace whites with Jews, or replace whites with Chechens or any other minority group in Russia. And suddenly the police are going to be knocking on your door, professor. So I think we need to have a bit of a reassessment. And of course, you're always welcome to come on our show to clarify this and to, try to win back the favor of the white race. But I think Dimitri and I can both definitively say that as members of the white race, I think the Western and Eastern faction of the Aryan race, we can firmly disavow these comments and say that we do believe that the white race should exist and should not die. And I think tweeting this nonsense immediately after telling everyone to become Orthodox is very much a bad look. But alas, Eurasianism, fourth political theory, always had a lot of holes.
No, well and truly. And I mean, I correctly put, like Professor Dugin, I mean, he is a polyglot. He can speak multiple languages. He can word, and he has in the past worded himself very carefully, especially in relation to President Putin and the Russian elites in order to evade, for example, prison time. He knows how to, for example, walk the thin line, right, and not cross. But here he makes this really sort of super hyperbolic, aggressive statement against all white people generally without any sort of tact. And that's because, Conrad, I think correctly put, white people are the easiest. You will not people to attack in the world right now. And that's because they are carriers of the Christian culture primarily, and obviously they are the main targets of the Talmudic tribe. So for Professor Dugin to even make these hyperbolic and really, I think, egregious statements so openly, it is quite safe for him to do so. And you'd think a philosopher of his level and somebody who's so knowledgeable would be a bit more tactful and a bit more knowledgeable about how exactly he should phrase himself, which is, well, look, if you have an issue with some of the philosophies that white people have developed over the last few hundred years under Kabbalistic, Freemasonic influence, then maybe call these things out directly. You don't need to necessarily attack the entirety of white people. And yes, I mean, it's just completely inappropriate. And correctly put, Conrad, if he ever said this about the Talmudic tribe or referenced any of the Orthodox saints speaking about Chabad, Lubavitch, or any of these organizations, even in the context of the Russo-Ukrainian war, he could be again targeted for under Section 282 of the Russian Criminal Code, which is, of course, installing an anti-ethnic, some sort of inter-ethnic fragmentary conflict within the Russian people, but specifically targeting white people. I mean, he's already doing that. He's already breaching Section 282 because he's frustrating the white population of the Russian Federation, many of whom are not even Slavic, some of which are of Germanic extraction and other white ethnicity groups which are living inside of European Russia itself. So, I mean, it's just quite bizarre that he went up on this, you can almost say like a bender of a commentary run. And it really does show, Conrad, I think at the end of the day, a lot of these massive intellectual figureheads in Russia, a lot of these are truly very, very smart people, but they are well and truly operating within the, how do I say, Żydowska iga, as monk prophet Abel once called it to Tsar Paul I in the early 1800s, literally a Jewish yoke which exists over the Russian population to this day and has not actually eclipsed itself since 1917. The Russian people are still so enslaved by this, just like the Tatar Mongols, who people could not negatively speak about, especially during the peak of the yoke in the late 1200s, early 1300s. You cannot speak ill of the tribe that rules over you because you will be apprehended. Because your families will be shut down. Your family members may even be killed. You'll be put into prison. Your publications will be closed, and you will not be able to make a living. And you may even be killed yourself. That's the reality in Russia right now, to the point where even the most outspoken, the most edgy philosopher has to skip around and play footsie with these particular ideas or speak favorably in relation to the Talmud or Kabbalah or any of these other bizarre theories, because you simply cannot even paraphrase or cite Orthodox Christian saints. I mean, Conrad, what we saw this week from the professor, unfortunately, I think is just another sign that I think that this group still holds significant influence within the Russian Federation, as they do in literally every single Western country plus Eastern Europe combined. Well, let's not face any illusions, but the yoke is well and truly not over. And the prophet monk Abel was correct when he said this to Tsar Paul I. He said Russia will face 3 yokes during its history: the Mongol yoke, the Polish yoke, and that's in the early 1600s. And he said, then the Jewish yoke will also take over Russia. And Tsar Paul answered, no, this cannot be. It will never happen. And he, of course, then gave him further prophecies. But even the Tsar Paul I was so taken aback by the clairvoyant sayings of monk Abel that he couldn't believe that the Jews would take over Russia in the early 1800s. I mean, it was completely nonsensical, especially during a period of Napoleonic wars. How could that even be possible? But we are here today, and we are witnesses to that prophecy. And this is why I think the show is very important. We have to put things into an Orthodox Christian context. Nothing hateful, nothing sort of not inspiring conflict anywhere. If anything, we're speaking about how conflict could be avoided properly, especially in places like Ukraine and Russia, over united commonalities. But sadly, I think provoking hatred against white people and blaming them for all the ills of society is just not the way to go about it. So sorry, Professor, but that was Vanta Black Hole.
That's really the only way to describe it. And unfortunately, the other news we have to report, almost in Dugin's favor here, we have the goyim of the Anglo-Saxons. If you want to shit on any, white people, it would be, the Brit bongers. Many of my ancestors are there, my cousins over there, and they had a recent election. And unfortunately, Restore Britain, the party that I guess everyone would want to vote to, they stood in 10 council seats as the Greater Yarborough Party to kind of cement Rupert Lowe and the other local people there, so that in the upcoming later election, they can field citizens across the entire nation and, contest every seat. But they did have their recent council elections, and Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, did crush Keir Starmer and Labour. This is according to preliminary results. It says Nigel Farage's Reform has secured a landslide victory in England, winning 1,414 seats in local councils, an increase of 1,412 seats compared to the previous election. Labour suffered heavy losses, dropping 1,358 seats and falling into second place. In Scotland, the left-wing nationalist SNP retained the lead for the fifth consecutive time with 57 seats. Labour lost 3 seats, finishing with 17. Reform UK achieved a breakthrough, winning 15 seats, all for the first time. When the Welsh Parliament election, Labour slumped to third place with just 9 seats. Plaid Cymru, the Party of Wales, took first place, while Reform UK came in second. So a huge major political shift. And again, in Greater Yarborough, all the seats that they ran in, Restore, or the Proto-Restore Party in Yarborough won. So major shift. The UK, they do seem to be waking up in some capacity, but unfortunately, even Restore, the most they can ever muster is a anti-kosher slaughter and a generally anti-war stance. There's really no counter-Semitic faction at all within the UK, even to the degree that the AFD, for example, is anti-Israel or Holocaust racial guilt for all Germans. So that's the situation in the UK. Fairly interesting, but not super surprising. Election results is just collapse after collapse. It's the collapse of the Tories. It's the collapse of Labour, then the collapse of the Tories, and the collapse of Labour and the Tories together, which is what we're witnessing right now. But U.S. troop withdrawals have started to hit NATO. They are pretending this big withdrawal, even though obviously it's mostly just a reshuffle. They're trying to get the European powers to beef up their forces again. Be sure to listen to our discussion again with Mike Painovich. We discussed the drones going into Russia, likely even from Estonia and the Baltic states, daring Russia to make a move on NATO. Of course, there's more and more fear-mongering. Everyone in Europe is convinced that Russia will be waging a war against them before 2035 and all these other dates and everything. So it's clear that the fear-mongering among the Europeans is being ramped up. Trump, much like he wanted them to help in the Strait of Hormuz, he also wants them to do more and be more aggressive against Russia in Ukraine. And of course, we all know that when Erdogan falls, the pressure will be on them to pressure Russia. And when those Bosphorus and Dardanelles straits close, then things are going to get very, very dramatic. And that will only expedite the world energy crisis even more, of course. But one of the other big pieces of news this week, of course, was this UFO disclosure. The first supposed batch of presidential UFO disclosure files dropped, I guess, this morning. We see one strange video of this compass-looking thing flying around in the sky at crazy angles, a few other weird UFO videos, but again, nothing that civilians haven't effectively already witnessed similar things of before. But apparently for the next 60 to 90 days, UFO disclosure is going to be ramping up. I encourage everyone to listen to it. It'll be linked down below. My recent appearance on The Reversion with Anthony Westgate. We discussed Father Seraphim Rose, who we'll get into in the church news segment of the show here, but really, really deep show on the UFO disclosure. We go through my extensive Twitter thread. Be sure to follow me at GnomeRad, all about Father Seraphim's perspective in his book, Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, on the UFO phenomenon, on aliens. And we got even a leak today that said apparently Jimmy Carter was told by the CIA that aliens have communicated with them, that all the religions, Christianity, Islam, all these things were presented to humanity by our real creators, these interdimensional aliens, to allow us to be good and allow us to behave ourselves while they conducted their experiments. And this apparently drove him to tears. And of course, the UFOs and aliens being demons narrative has long proliferated the internet for so long that hearing that there's more responses saying, oh, Jimmy Carter got one-shotted by this Redditeer nonsense. And, it is interesting to see that, so many people have woken up to this, where I speculate on the stream with Anthony that perhaps all of the red pill, J.D. Vance thinks that aliens are demons. So this might be something that is incorporated into the PSYOP itself. And it might be a little bit more complex than just, oh, aliens created us, God not real, which sounds like that was working in the 60s and 70s. People were getting one-shotted by that kind of Reddit atheism. But I think philosophy and public understanding of God and spirituality has sort of progressed beyond that. Even just with people's psychedelic use and these other sorts of things. So I think it's an interesting development. We're going to be, keep tabs on the World War Now social medias. We're going to be posting about it. And again, like I said, listen to my episode with Anthony. We go into more details. But Dimitri, what are your thoughts on this UFO disclosure and I guess the UK elections as well?
It's very unfortunate about the UK election. When you hear sad results like this from all over Europe, we can always point towards, in some capacity, the Hungarian elections as well. But a lot of these elections receiving bad results, you have to keep in mind one of the main tenets of why these elections aren't as successful as they should be, perhaps on alt media spaces. We do see these oppositionary parties having such popularity. I think the reason why is because the mainstream media sources are still the main points of interest for a lot of the boomer populations of the entire Western world, really, and even in SNG countries like former Soviet nations. The boomers, anyone over the age of 60, which is such a large population now that we have like life extension technologies, people do live for a long time. People are generally healthier than they have been in previous decades and centuries. So there's a huge boomer wealthy population across literally the first and second world who are voting for mainstream parties who are then supporting mass migration, ethnic replacement of Europeans. And until those people can be reached, and unfortunately, the only probably extension that they use in terms of old media is like Facebook and maybe Vkontakte VK, but they don't even go on Twitter, or even Telegram is a bit too technologically savvy for them. It's just really unfortunate. I think that's the reality we all face. The boomers are in some ways the engine of Zog across the world, be it in Russia, be it in Europe, be it in the Americas. Sadly, I think this is just another symptom of that. It's just the boomers voting for their own extinction. And who knows? I mean, what is their position long term? Is like to be looked after in a nursing home by a Pakistani migrant or a Somalian. It's just really unfortunate. Nobody wins from a lot of their actions, but and sadly, they are participating in these criminal activities of the replacement of Europeans. They are becoming liable. You can't just say, feign ignorance. I'm sorry, but you will need to answer before God for some of these insane decisions of supporting these politicians who are openly destroying the once great country of Albion, like these great islands which have produced so many Orthodox Christian and even pre-Roman Catholic saints. And that has been one of the heartlands of Christianity across Europe. And it's been completely changed forever. Like this new migration wave that we're seeing right now is unprecedented, and they will have long-lasting results. So this is, just really unfortunate news. In relation to the UFO disclosure, really, I mean, it's another massive distraction for the Goyim and another way of just moving the goalposts. I mean, talk about disclosure. These are the people who are still hiding millions of Epstein files from us and trying to the best of their ability of moving the conversation away from the fact that there are cannibalistic, eugenic, in the most like Talmudic sense, and pedophilic elites ruling over many Western countries which have ties, cross-national elite ties, and of course they're all related to Israel in some way. I mean, this is just the worst type of disclosure for them to receive is what has come out in the Epstein files recently, confirming so many of us are conspiracy theorists, and the fact that, what we've been saying has been at least partially true over the last few years and really is indisputable at this point. It's become mainstream news, and I think this is just another way of moving the conversation away from that. And look, if there is a massive alien reveal in the end, I think Father Seraphim Rose, or shall I say Saint Seraphim Rose's perspective on it is, I think, the primal one that Orthodox Christians should be taking up against all of this nonsense.
Again, it seems that people have convinced Trump that him being the UFO guy is good for his legacy. But again, he's obviously feeding into, I think, an even broader Jewish psyop when this is all going down at the same time as the Iran war and, new weapons being unveiled in warfare and everything. I think there's a component to that could be here when they want to start using directed energy or other more advanced methods of warfare to break this stalemate, to get into Iran, to get their material, to kill their leadership, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Maybe they need a new technological edge, and they need this UFO disclosure stuff to sort of break the ice on a lot of the stuff that we've supposedly reverse engineered from aliens, which, again, I don't really believe for 5 seconds. But other election-related news, unfortunately, no surprise, Vivek Ramaswamy is the Republican nominee for governor in Ohio. So it looks like the white man is voting Democrat this year in Ohio. If you live in Ohio, time to grit your teeth and vote against Jeet Vivek. We can't be having the Indian pro-migration guy running for president after becoming governor of one of our very important red swing states. So again, I'm not going to relitigate the whole issue. I think Nick Fuentes has made a good case for this. I'm not advocating voting for Democrat in your elections even. I'm not even going to go that far. Again, I think I'm ambivalent on whether or not the Republicans keep the House, but as far as Vivek, we can't allow him to become the governor of Ohio. It's just not worth it. Amy Acton, a boring white woman Democrat, and she's not really a threat. In 2-4 years, we can easily get her out of there, but we really do have to stand against Vivek, and I would hold that position regardless of if Nick Fuentes had it. But I think he elucidated it pretty well on his show. But before we talk about church news, Dimitri, do you have any thoughts on Vivek? Because I think we really need to draw a line in the sand on the Hinduification and the Jeetification of America. Texas, here it's really bad. I know Canada is really bad. Ohio, we can't be having this happening in these heartland parts of America.
Yeah, but you just need to also consider the fact that why are Republicans like allying with Hindus at this point, and why are they inviting specifically Hindus, to places like the UK, to Canada so readily, to America, and like what is this alliance? Well, it's primarily because Hindus are it is such a comfortable religion that coexists with Freemasonry, coexists with Kabbalah, with the Talmud, with the Talmudic tribe. I mean, India was a colony of these people for close to a century, from the 19th to the 20th century. I mean, they were literally like cross-British and Masonic lodges created. There's an entire lecture series created by Father Oleg Stinaev, the head military priest in the Russian Federation, coincidentally, friend of Andrei Afanasyev, who actually made a video series about how the British were trying to integrate Freemasonry and Hinduism back in the day, and they've created a lot of these aggressive amalgamations of the Hindu religion to be exported to the West, so including other elements of that particular strand of pagan worship, including yoga, right? So all of these other ideas, these are all Masonic exportations. So this alliance between the Hindus, the Zionists, and sort of Western liberals, and even the Republican establishment, it's quite an old one, dare I say. I mean, probably going back to the British imperial days. We shouldn't be too surprised. And yes, absolutely, Vivek's recent statement that he believes Jesus Christ is the Son of God, he confirmed, but he's one of the sons of God, and all this other like ecumenist nonsense. I mean, this is Antichrist level rhetoric. Just imagine, in some ways, I dare say, maybe Hinduism will be one of those reigning religions that will accept the Moshiach Antichrist first, and they'll literally claim, yeah, he's one of these figures who will like lead us. He's an avatar of so and so God, and they will be. There's no surprise that, I mean, they are pushing this Vivek scammer. Who knows, his previous reputation in the pharmaceutical industry is very sketchy as well. It's just an embarrassment that the Republicans, that part of the MAGA movement has converted to this. I mean, what a move away from the 2016 standards and maybe what some of the alt-right figures were calling for in 2015, 2016. It really is absolutely like the last nail in the coffin is, promoting an Indian politician to run, and potentially, as you said correctly, Conrad, in the future, multi-ethnic America, you could have like a Marco Rubio Vivek ticket or something horrific of that nature. And, we just have to pray against that for sure, at the very least, and definitely not be voting for somebody like Ramaswamy. I mean, an incredibly dangerous person.
Very well said. And, James Fishback, he's setting a good example in Florida. And again, like I've said before on the show, in 2028, we have to put forward somebody that isn't J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio. We need to be, at this point, I think everyone who listens to the show knows enough people in their day-to-day life that have kind of been red-pilled on a lot of these issues. So it's time to turn that knowledge, red-pilling, general, consciousness changing and rising consciousness of identity, of awareness of the Jewish question, these other things, time to turn that into electoral reality. So I think everyone knows really what that looks like. So if you're in Florida, James Fishback. If you're in Ohio, unfortunately, it's Democrat times. So it is what it is, but got to grit your teeth and sometimes do that for the sake of politics. But when it comes to church news, of course, everybody's been talking about the glorification and canonization of Father Seraphim Rose. Before we get into that, I want to get into the situation about the Georgian election, and then I'll ask Dimitri about Ukrainian persecution, like we usually do. This is from Ortho Christian. It says here, the Georgian Orthodox Church will hold an expanded church council next week to elect a new Catholicos Patriarch. His Eminence Metropolitan Shio, locum tenens of the Patriarchal Throne, announced in his homily for the Feast of St. George yesterday. You know that next week we will have to hold a large, expanded church council where the election of the new Catholicos Patriarch must take place, Metropolitan Shio told the congregation. I want to ask our clergy, our monastic community, each of you, our dear flock, to intensify our prayers so that we may conduct this great event with dignity, peacefully with love, so that God's will may be revealed and there may be a beneficial choice, a decision for our church and our people. Of course, first of all, let us appeal to St. George and may his grace help us. The election follows the repose of His Holiness Catholicos Patriarch Ilya II on March 17th. Last month, the Georgian Synod selected 3 candidates to replace him, Metropolitan Shio of Sanaki and Chkorotsku, Metropolitan Yob of Mroveli and Urbanisi, and Metropolitan Grigol of Poti and Kobe. The Church Council will convene to choose among the 3 metropolitans to lead the Georgian Orthodox Church. And if you remember, the previous first round, which had 6 or 7 candidates, Metropolitan Shio received 20 votes, Metropolitan Yob and Metropolitan Grigol both received 7 votes. So it seems that even if both of those candidates, people combined their votes, it's very unlikely for anyone to surpass Metropolitan Shio. But I think he only has to gain 1 vote, and then he immediately becomes the Patriarch if he gets all the votes he got before. So very encouraging to see. Keep it all in prayer that the Holy Spirit may work. But before we discuss Father Seraphim, Dimitri, you have any updates on Ukraine?
Yes, some absolutely horrific news from the Ukraine. And this is, fortunately, it did end more or less well, but I mean, it was a scare to the point of unprecedented scale. And this maybe speaks to, we'd have to agree with Professor Dugin here, where he says basically in order to subdue the evil that rules Ukraine, you need to really liberate the entirety of its territory, which I completely agree with. I think all of Ukraine needs to become a part of Russia again, as per, I mean, the sayings of the old saints, and I mean, none of all the figures of the Orthodox Church basically historically have agreed with this opinion. But, and this is why, in the far western sections of Ukraine, in the diocese of Vladimir Volhynsky, the Metropolitan of Vladimir Volhynsky, coincidentally also named Vladimir, so Metropolitan Vladimir, he's 57 years of age. He was traveling in a car, I believe. They were exiting a settlement that they were visiting. So the Metropolitan obviously travels around his diocese in a car, visiting random villages and settlements in order to give spiritual counsel to people, attend funerals, all these other things that typically our bishops do in their respective dioceses, as the ancient apostles did. As he was exiting from the settlement of Derno, which is close to the city of Kotov, there was a mobile military checkpoint of Ukrainians, and they stopped the vehicle, and then they picked up Metropolitan Vladimir, opened the car doors, they grabbed him, they grabbed Archbishop Alexander Kubenko, and also the deacon that was with them, Dmitry Manetsky. So, Father Dmitry, Archpriest Alexander, and Metropolitan Vladimir all picked up, and they attempted to kidnap them. They checked their documents, and then they pepper sprayed Archpriest Alexander when he tried to protect the Metropolitan. So he started getting in, basically his eyes started watering, they all turned red, he couldn't see anymore. He also had an allergy to that particular pepper spray, so he began basically convulsing. They grabbed, specifically I think Father Alexander and Metropolitan Vladimir, and dragged them into one of these vans that kidnap Ukrainians. I mean, it sounds like a horror movie, but they grabbed them, put them into one of these vans. Metropolitan Vladimir started suffering a heart attack on the scene. And Father Alexander was convulsing from the allergic reactions to the gas that the Ukrainian military men sprayed him with. There were police nearby, Ukrainian law enforcement, unrelated to the military, but they simply watched. And suddenly the Ukrainian car actually, for whatever reason, maybe they got a call from the top or somebody called the entire operation off, but they actually opened the van, they released Metropolitan Vladimir, they released Father Alexander around 10 meters away from the checkpoint. So they didn't get very far away. And then they left to go back to the checkpoint along with the police officers and drove off. And when the current health state of Metropolitan Vladimir and Father Alexander is stable, fortunately, but Metropolitan Vladimir published on his Facebook page of the official Vladimir Volhynsky website that all clergy and church servants of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church need to remain maximally vigilant and cautious. And this is far western Ukraine. So just imagine what would happen if Russia, for example, has a long-term ceasefire or peace treaty with this particular regime. Do you think, if this isn't written into that agreement, do you think these attacks on the church will stop? I doubt that very much, but this is absolutely a horrific story. Fortunately, by the prayers of no doubt the Ukrainian saints themselves, this event didn't become worse than it could have been. Other news, of course, from Ukraine, and specifically actually from Europe related to Ukraine, was, of course, the ROCOR Council that took place in Germany, in Munich, where they released a message on the 5th of May. We'll probably discuss some of the great news from that, but specifically they had a paragraph about the Ukrainian war, and the wording they use is very curious, and I'll sort of provide some commentary on this because it may arise in other pro-Russian circles in the future. So the statement they made was, "We grieve over the suffering of people in various countries of the world. Wars, conflicts, and persecutions both against Christians and against all peoples enduring many hardships, especially in the fratricidal war between Christians who emerged from the baptismal font of Kievan Rus." Very interesting. Firstly, just a few comments about this particular paragraph. So they mention how the world is basically full of war, right? Conflict, which is what we talk about on the show. So persecution happening literally everywhere. Lebanon, and in Lebanon specifically, just to refer to another story, there's more photographs of Israelis attacking Christian sites. For example, an Israeli member of the IDF putting a cigarette in the mouth of the Mother of God, the Virgin Mary, in a small white marble statue of hers, and then taking a photo, pretending that she's smoking. I mean, this sort of desecration happening in South Lebanon is still practicing. That's what the bishops here are referring to. They're saying, obviously, that the war in Ukraine is fratricidal, which is a very, I would say, contentious opinion, but it's one that they share, of course, the hierarchs of ROCOR share with Metropolitan Onufry personally, because he called it a fratricidal war. a brotherly war back in 2022. And at the time, many even Russian hierarchs disagreed with that opinion, and including many people we had on this show, I think especially from the Russian Federation, hardcore sort of patriots, maybe people on Sparse TV would disagree. They say the war right now, the special military operation, is not fratricidal. It is a war against the evil terrorist Zelensky regime specifically, right? It is to defend the people of the Donbass, the SMO zone. So you can kind of see the two concepts of it being a fratricidal war of sort of even parties is a different opinion to that of, say, the very pro-Russian Z crowd, especially even the Orthodox Christian side of that crowd. People like Andrei Afanasyev would probably take the latter opinion rather than calling this a fratricidal civil war among Orthodox Christian Slavs or something of that nature. That would be a secondary, if not later on down in his sort of views of what exactly this current conflict is. But just to give our listeners, and I mean, you guys, our listeners are very learned to begin with, but there is a diversity of opinions among Orthodox Christian-based people. I mean, these Rokor hierarchs are amazing, and you'll kind of see exactly why, because this council was incredibly awesome. But it's one of the points is that they agree with Metropolitan Onufri here. They also, of course, mentioned the baptismal font of Kievan Rus. So notice the term Kievan Rus is a strictly historic term. It never existed in actual historical terms. There was never a state called Kievan Rus. It was always Kняжество Kievskoye, so the princedom of Kiev, the duchy of Moscow, the duchy of Vladimir, for example, Ryazan, Chernigov, or the Grand Duchy of Kiev. It was never called Kievan Rus. That is a historical term similar to the word Byzantium. When we talk about the Byzantine Empire, we're referring to, of course, the Roman Empire. Even calling it Eastern Roman Empire is technically incorrect. Kievan Rus is an artificial term created by Russian historians in the early 1800s, specifically for reasons of, to define a particular period from the time of Rurik and Oleg and Igor and Svyatoslav, of course, primarily, and definitely the baptism of Rus under Olga and Prince Vladimir, from that time until the Mongol hordes invaded in the mid-1200s, and naturally Moscow was uplifted under Saint Ivan Kalita or Saint Danil Alexandrovich, the son of Alexander Nevsky. So Kievan Rus is a historical period, and it's just interesting that the hierarchs refer to it as such. Just want to sort of give that definition. It has nothing to do with like modern Ukraine or that having some sort of primacy over Russia. I mean, that's just nonsense. So the hierarchs are completely appropriately using a historical term, even in their own statement, which is, I think, good to see. Some more insane news. I mean, this is not directly related to church persecution, but it is directly related to the genocide of white Orthodox Christian Slavs in Ukraine, because we had Ukraine's chief rabbi, Moshe Azman, invite this Ukrainian commander, Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Kharkavy, which is his nickname is Skala, which means mountain. So the mountain, right, this Ukrainian lieutenant colonel was invited into the chief synagogue of Kiev. It sounds like a bit of a joke or a caricature, but Skala was invited into the synagogue, and him and Moshe Azman, they spoke about the need for Ukrainian Jews to have a comfortable place to serve, and how Skala's specific battle regiment that he has, his particular battalion is incredibly, is a comfortable place for all Jews to serve in. Specifically, he said, we agreed that Jewish soldiers would have an opportunity to come to the synagogue if they want to, interact with the community, and receive everything necessary for spiritual support. So who is this like? So that we have one of the chief commanders of a Ukrainian regiment, which is very important. Some of its servicemen and high officers are Jews. And what's interesting is that this particular regiment is, in fact, some people say it is the chief regiment under the command of Alexander Syrskyi, so the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. So this is an elite infantry regiment of the Ukrainian army, which has Jewish officers who now personally meet with Ukraine's chief rabbi and attend synagogues. The other really, I would say, really horrific thing about this regiment, and this is why it relates to the genocide of Orthodox Christians and just Slavs in the Ukrainian war, is because this regiment of the commander Skala, it has at least 20 times the loss rate of personnel compared to any other regiment. It's called the meat grinder regiment. They carry out what's so-called meat assaults under the orders of course, Syrskyi himself on occasion. And this is reported by Ukrainian parliamentary members themselves. Specifically, Mariana Bezula actually said that Skala is Syrskyi's personal regiment commander with the highest casualty statistics. So They're very strange, but yes, Ukraine literally has Ashkenazi leaders, commanders, officers who collaborate with rabbis. And who knows? I mean, Alexander Sirsky comes off as an ethnic Russo-Ukrainian, but the people just directly under him are literally attending synagogal services. This kind of helps you, I guess, flesh out the idea that, look, not everything is, it's not really a fratricidal war if we really sort of dig deep between the two fighting sides here. And yeah, it is incredibly concerning what's happening at the moment. But the news about Metropolitan Vladimir in Ukraine at the moment is, I would say, some of the most horrific news. The fact that a 57-year-old Metropolitan is somehow fit to be taken into service is completely insane. And just one more statement. This is related to, obviously, Orthodox Christian politics in general. But Patriarch Daniel of Bulgaria had a really good interview on Bulgarian television, and he said the following, and this is related to the church criticizing politicians. He says, the church is called to bear witness to the truth, and when certain politicians attempt to justify themselves through seemingly noble means, while behind them stand lies and deception, the church is obligated to expose this, to protect the souls of the faithful from the effects of this hatred, to call upon people to reflect on whether they are doing good or in fact destroying their souls. It is our responsibility to bear witness to the truth before the world. So Patriarch Daniel of Bulgaria basically says that it is correct to call out the hypocrisy and the lying nature of politicians around the world. I mean, and we have to completely agree with the Patriarch Daniel here, because this is exactly the position not just of the show, but literally of the teachings of the church and Orthodox tradition and what the saints have said before us.
Again, the yoke of the Ukrainian church is always, they've continued to endure it, and it seems, again, the only thing that's going to stop it is the complete demise of this government in Kiev. So pray for them, pray for that they're able to worship, and pray that their hierarchs, again, are able to survive these perilous conditions that they're being put in every day by these recruiters and these goons. But final topic, I guess, in the church news segment is, of course, Father Seraphim Rose. The headline from the UOJ this week read, ROCOR canonizes Father Seraphim Rose, which was, again, a bit misleading. The ROCOR Synod voted to, receive the recent findings of the Commission on the Glorification of Father Seraphim Rose, or on his life, led by Bishop James of Sonora. And they've agreed to sort of move forward with the process of glorification, which I thought maybe the most generous that I thought was maybe preparations were being made for September 2nd glorification liturgy at Platina in California at Father Seraphim's relics. But there was an interview with Bishop Irene, the ROCOR bishop of the United Kingdom. He's on the ROCOR Synod. They asked him, did the recent Council of Bishops canonize Hieromonk Seraphim of Platina? Bishop Irene said, no, it did not. A saint's glorification isn't pronounced as some administrative decision from a session of a council. This is not how our church abroad functions. He said, we acknowledge that his glorification is, if I may use a popular phrase, on the horizon. The interviewer said, some have reported that the Synod is now preparing hagiography and formal materials for the canonization events. Is that correct? He then says, not at all. So we're probably a little bit farther away, at the very least, I think a year and a half or so away from the actual canonization liturgy happening. But as he said, it is on the horizon. So nothing but encouraging things. No need to overhype it. And again, as I said on my stream with Anthony, where we discussed this, I already know Father Seraphim Rose, Saint Seraphim Rose, is a saint. So much like the spiritual children of Elder Ephraim that knew him intimately, they're in no rush to see him canonized, let alone by someone like Elpidophoros. I don't need anyone to tell me Father Seraphim is a saint. So it will happen in God's time. But I think with the UFO disclosure, it's no doubt that the fact that he's now being inducted into the hall of known glorified saints who we can ask for their intercession and whose works will be counted among the consensus patrum, having his work on the UFO question and aliens, as it appears this whole disclosure thing and attempts to undermine Christianity from an epistemological scientific perspective. It's good to have his work and his corpus now kind of lifted up by the church as well. So I think that's very important, and it's evidence of the Holy Spirit being aware of what we need when we need it in these latter days. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on Father Seraphim Dimitri before we land the plane here.
I think very encouraging news out of Germany, and just the fact that they are, in fact, it's not just on the horizon. I think it's more or less an inevitability at this point. His life has already been investigated by different, private citizens, people within the church itself. He was venerated even during his own life and well respected in the West American, just general American community. Many have read his biography. He's probably brought not just tens of thousands, I would say maybe hundreds of thousands of people to the faith around the world. His works are extremely popular in the Russian Federation. He's well known as sort of a new saint of the late 20th century, somebody that the church really does need, and who I think, in terms of actually providing fruitful advice as a church father of sorts of the modern times, he is somebody who absolutely should be popularized, in church. And this is what I think an official canonization really helps towards. It popularizes a particular saint, their stances, their positions, and hopefully that inspires further sainthood among other members of the Orthodox Church, people to follow his example, even if they do not reach his level of sainthood, just as so many of us Orthodox Christians around the world may not reach the levels of sainthood of, say, Saint Mary of Egypt, for example, or other saints of the church, but we may be inspired by them. We may follow in their example as they themselves follow the example of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So it's just a really heartwarming opportunity. And I think now we're almost a generation, we are a generation into the 21st century. It's absolutely the correct time. And there were many examples in the past of saints being canonized whilst they're spiritual children, whilst people who knew the saints were still alive in their lives. The best example of Saint John of Shanghai and San Francisco, whose sainthood I think is not doubted by anybody in terms of, in the American context, absolutely is without a doubt a saint who passed away, I believe, in the early 1970s, if not late 1960s. So that's just without question. I think there's no need to delay these sort of things. And if anything, it will only benefit the church to have such a representative depicted on the icons at the entrances to churches and parishes. What a great saint to have, especially for American Orthodox Christians, sort of divided among so many jurisdictions. But that's not something that necessarily held Father Seraphim back during his life. And after him, it may be just one of these unifying factors, a general, not just a local church, but a Catholic unifying glorification that's required. And I don't think there will be a single jurisdiction which will be throwing this into doubt at all.
Many people know that of all the Orthodox authors and writers, Seraphim Rose was the most influential on my conversion to Orthodoxy, between Orthodoxy and the religion of the future, God's revelation of the human heart, nihilism, and in particular, the soul after death, his reflection on the toll houses, near-death experiences, and, what literally happens to the soul after a human's repose. That book, really convicted me. And in that moment, reading that book was when I sort of had I now know that Orthodoxy is true. So I'll always be indebted to him for that. And I won't go into too many details, but at one point, there are many rumors. You'll hear a lot more slander of Father Seraphim and bringing up of dirty things from his past online and other places as this goes further along. The Catholics have already been running with it, so don't let that deter you. When I was first reading about his life back in 2020, 2021, I was praying to God, asking, is this person a saint? Lord, should I be venerating them? I always like your assurance because his writings have had such an impact on me, and I'm not going to, go into any details and spiritually lay myself out there. But let's just say I got an answer, and I can confirm, as far as if there's anything that I know, and there's, many things that I'm very confident in, a few things that I know. One of them is, I believe Father Seraphim Rose is a saint in heaven praying for us. So hopefully the church recognizes it sooner rather than later. But it's very clear, at least, Dimitri, that you and I will live to see it, barring the Lord calling us home sooner than we may imagine. But this has been a fantastic episode. Thank you, everyone, for making it here to the end. A slightly shorter episode. We're finally getting under 2 hours here, but I have a feeling that June in particular, if not the end of May, we're really going to see some things heat up, whether it's Erdogan in Turkey or more things in Iran, or it's even natural disasters or things in the Far East that we're not even anticipating too much on the show. We're going to be diving into all of that next week, so be sure to tune in every week. World War Now, worldwarnow.co. Before I do all the plugs, Dimitri, I'll leave you with the last word.
Yes, thank you all for listening. We are almost at the halfway point between Easter and the Holy Feast Day of Pentecost, which we do share across old and new calendars. So we're almost reaching that no man's land of the two calendars, which will be diverging soon after Pentecost. But it's a very fantastic time, I think, at the moment to be following a lot of the Orthodox Christian content creators out there online. We really appreciate the support. We have great 8th hour episodes coming up for you guys. Definitely subscribe on Substack. Thank you for following us. Again, these tuned into the Telegram, because a lot of the ceasefire discussions and what is happening between Russia and Ukraine, specifically around the Victory Day, and congratulations, happy Victory Day for those celebrating around the world. If that means something to you, that's really good. And for those actually concerned and who want to follow the news strictly as to when it happens and it breaks before the next episode launches, just follow us primarily, I think, on X and Telegram, because we will have those hot takes for you available. So stay tuned. We really appreciate it, and keep myself and Conrad definitely in your prayers as we analyze all the news that are dropping.
Thank you for that. Dimitri, like you said, keep us all in your prayers, the persecuted people in Ukraine, the Levant, everywhere else, and of course, us, so that we don't come under delusion as we bring you all this information. Of course, again, thank you all for making it to the end of the episode. worldwarnow.co is where our home base is, where you can find everything. It's where these episodes are released first, and it's where all of our Ether Hour episodes are. Please get behind the paywall, just $7 a month. Some deals on that might be coming soon. So $7 a month, or even less, $75 a year if you support us. That way you get access to all 120 plus episodes of Ether Hour, hundreds of hours of content, including our episode with Mike Painovich, which was really incredible, really great stuff. Our recent episode with Benjamin Michael, formerly known as Luigi, our episodes with Father Peter Heers, our episodes with former Lebanese Defense Minister Yaqub Saraf, our interview with Zainab Al-Safar, Al Mayadeen TV host, Hezbollah media representative, of course, so many other incredible guests, Father John Whiteford, Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson. I could go on and on, but please support us that way. If you're already behind the paywall, or you just want to support us with a one-time payment, please go to the Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/World War Now. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube. If you search World War Now, I'm live there every Tuesday evening, 7:45 p.m. Central Time, 8:45 p.m. Eastern. You can ask me whatever questions you want in the form of a super chat. We play Ethnoguesser. We have a great time. It's great. Be sure to follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. Follow us on X. We're also live there, obviously, at World War Now _. Be sure to follow me on X at GnomeRad. Follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you search World War Now under podcasts, it will come up. Leave us 5 stars. Leave us a review. It always helps us out. Leave a comment on this episode. Let us know what you thought. Let us know your analysis. Do you think the war is going to erupt in the month of May? Do you think we're going to have more ceasefires? Do you think there's going to be a deal? What do you think is coming for June? We would love to hear what you guys all have to say in the comments. And of course, like the episode, in particular on Substack. We want to get as many Substack likes as possible. We should be getting over 100 Substack likes per episode, but alas, the audience is too lazy, and many listeners refuse to make Substack accounts and only listen to the episodes in their email browsers. So get the Substack app if you haven't already. But again, worldwarnow.co, that's the home base. We're live there as well. So YouTube X and Substack is where we are live. Substack's where you can find all of our content. So we hope to see you in the comments. Get behind the paywall to support us once again, and we will see you on the next one. God bless.